Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I was looking back through my older videos and I realized that I had to go all the way back to July to see the last time that I did a reaction to one of my friend Mr. Beats videos. He does a lot of great content associated especially with things like the U.S. presidents. That's a love that he and I have in common. And without giving away too much, there may be something coming up down the road where he and I maybe join together in something related to a president from here in Northeast Ohio, but we'll see what happens with that. In the meantime, he's got a video, every U.S. president's favorite U.S. president. So I thought this would be interesting. I'll put the link down in the description below. I'm also going to pin in the comment section link to a whole playlist of all of the videos I've done of Mr. Beats over time. It goes all the way back to the very first videos I did reacting to him, where he was ranking his 10 best and 10 worst presidents. And I had some pretty strong opinions about him back then on those things. And I've since come to get to know him as a friend. We do have very different views of the world and of politics and things like that. But I have incredible respect for him. And I think that that is mutual. And I think we just see the world differently. And that's okay. We need people who see the world differently. So with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and dive into every U.S. president's favorite U.S. president.
To me, this photo goes hard. It captures a future American president meeting the current one.
Yeah, first of all, Matt, a little old to be using the Gen Z lingo, aren't we? That's something my 12-year-old would say, that it goes hard, but no, it's okay. I've given you a hard time about it. No, I love this photo too, and to me, this one and then the photo of a young child, Theodore Roosevelt, looking in the window, looking out the window as Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession goes by in New York City in 1865, are two incredible photos of a current or recently deceased president and a future president in the same photo.
On one side, a 16-year-old, so excited, perhaps even inspired so much by this very moment that he one day hopes to be a president himself. On the other side, a tired and stressed out president who just months later would be assassinated. In case you didn't know, the 16-year-old in the picture was Bill Clinton, and Clinton's favorite president is John F. Kennedy, so it's pretty cool that he got to meet him when he was a kid.
And you know, that makes a lot of sense to me, because I see a lot of similarities between Kennedy and Clinton as far as both being Democrat presidents who weren't afraid to go against their own party and sometimes espoused beliefs that were more associated with the other side. And I wish we had more of that. People who didn't just toe the party line of their own side, who stood for what was right. In fact, Kennedy was the one who said that we should be looking for the right answer, not the Democrat answer or the Republican answer. But I'm guessing with some of these presidents, obviously, unless the president directly said, so-and-so was my favorite president, then we're really kind of just speculating and going off of whatever evidence we have, which is totally fine. That's all we can do.
Well, I'm Mr. Beat. And you likely already know my favorite American president. It's William Henry Harrison. No, I was just kidding. It's George Washington. You know this. I can't believe some of you actually thought it was William Henry Harrison. Who do you think I am? Anyway, did you know that presidents are people too? Huh? It's true. One reason why American presidents fascinate me so much is the fact that so many of them were just ordinary people who rose up to the most powerful position in the world. Some of them really did have humble beginnings. And hey, also, did you know that they all used to be children? And many of them grew up idolizing presidents? Huh. How about that? Often presidents have a big influence on our worldviews.
So we got a young Lyndon Johnson on the right shaking hands with Franklin Roosevelt. That's a pretty cool picture.
So it should be no surprise that future presidents looked up to presidents. So how do we know who the favorite president was of every president? Well, sometimes they just straight up said it.
Andrew Jackson, we thank you for your service. We honor you for your memory.
You ever hear of Andrew Jackson of Tennessee?
I don't think he's saying, at least in those ones, just because he's honoring and remembering him doesn't make him his favorite, though. I can see why Andrew Jackson would probably be a favorite of Donald Trump.
Very great Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson, a great president and a great general.
Was a military hero and genius.
Or if they didn't straight up say it, we know their favorite president by whom they referenced all the time.
I mean, that's what Trump just did there. He didn't straight up say it was his favorite president. He just referenced him a lot.
Can say that I feel a special gratitude to this singular figure who, in so many ways, made my own story possible.
And this is actually kind of interesting because, and this shows you that the changes that are undergoing, we are undergoing constantly in our party system, and we're in the middle of a party system shift right now. You've got a modern Democrat president praising the first Republican president, and you have a modern Republican president in Trump praising really the first president of the modern Democratic Party.
In 1854, Lincoln was simply a Springfield lawyer who'd served just a single term in Congress. What is it that makes Lincoln such a seminal figure in our story? How is it that this man, born in the backwoods of Kentucky, with little formal education, homely and awkward, a man given to depression.
Interesting that the caption on that one, I don't know if that was on C-SPAN or what, but spelled his first name wrong.
Wait, holy crap. Look at that typo. Anyway, we also saw who their favorite president was by how they decorated the Oval Office, or just through their policies and political beliefs. Sometimes, though, we don't have much evidence to rely on at all. So, in those cases, I'm just going to guess. In this video,
I actually really appreciate that he laid all that out and basically said, here's the criteria I'm using. Totally fine with that. You know, there's no way we can know for sure.
We're looking at every president's favorite president. Heck, maybe we'll even check out every president's favorite president, if you're lucky. The first few presidents of the United States mostly loved each other. I mean, there was a rough patch in the late 1790s, but otherwise, yeah, none of them, of course, had a favorite president. That actually would have been a weird thing to say in 1804. But George Washington often said many nice things about John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Although, as partisanship heated up in the 1790s, he did begin to critique Jefferson and Madison in particular.
But it's fair to say that George Washington never had an opportunity to critique Jefferson or Madison as president because he died before Jefferson became president.
And Washington surely preferred John Adams over the other two since, you know, he was his vice president. Plus, Washington served in the Adams administration as commander-in-chief of the armed forces.
He did.
So I guess George Washington's favorite president was John Adams? That's a weird thing to say, though, especially since Adams was the only president Washington ever saw in office other than himself. And he only saw Adams as president for less than 3 years. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were famously best friends, then worst enemies, as mostly demonstrated in their presidential campaigns against each other, and then best friends again later in life.
Highly encourage anybody who is interested to read the letters that these men wrote back and forth to each other the last decade and a half or so of their lives. Incredible insight into, and there's if you haven't seen the John Adams series, I'm going to once again recommend it, and it's becoming one of the VTH drinking game things for me to mention the John Adams series, but I'm mentioning it again. You have to watch it. They show a lot of those letters and excerpts from them, and there's a quote in there, and I don't know if it's I think it actually is an actual quote from Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence himself from Pennsylvania, who said that he considered Jefferson and Adams to be the north and south poles of the Revolution. Because they were very different in many ways. Adams was very headstrong and outspoken, and Jefferson, while very strong in terms of his beliefs, was much quieter and more of a writer than a speaker. They had very different views on federalism, and of course had a pretty big falling out during the time of their presidencies.
But despite them ultimately making up, all the evidence that I've seen about both suggests that
Washington.
They probably would have said that George Washington was the best president if asked. That said, Jefferson...
Yeah, and remember that Jefferson also served under Washington. Jefferson was our very first Secretary of State. In fact, in the early times of our country, I would say for the first 70, 80 years or so, Secretary of State is kind of the main stepping stone to the presidency. So many of our presidents were secretaries of state. Madison, Jefferson, Monroe, John Quincy Adams, James Buchanan. I'm sure there's others that I'm not thinking of that were secretaries of state.
And also greatly respected his buddy, James Madison, the president who had very similar policies as him. In fact, the 8 years Madison served as president after the 8 years Jefferson served as president were strikingly similar. It was basically 16 years straight of one administration, man. And yep, Madison often looked up to Jefferson. Not just literally, since he was
5'4",
nearly a foot shorter than Jefferson, but also
Jefferson, one of our tallest presidents, one of our few presidents, especially early on, that was over 6 foot. Madison, I think 5'4", shortest president.
Jefferson often was a mentor to Madison. For this reason, I'd argue Madison's favorite president was Jefferson.
I think that's fair.
James Monroe's favorite president was likely Thomas Jefferson. Not only was he good friends with him, but he constantly sought his advice.
Yeah.
Heck, at one point, they were neighbors. Monroe once wrote to Jefferson, quote, "I feel that whatever I am at present in the opinion of others, or whatever I may be in the future, has greatly arose from your friendship."
Think about the stability of that time in American history. You have Jefferson, Virginian, 8 years, Democratic Republican in terms of party affiliation, 8 years in the White House. Then you have Madison, Virginian, Democratic Republican, from 8 years in the White House. Then you have Monroe, Virginian, Democratic Republican, 8 years in the White House.
Aww. John Quincy Adams clearly greatly respected and admired his father, John Adams. So I know this seems clearly biased, but John Quincy Adams' favorite president was his dad.
Not only that, but I think politically you can see a lot of similarities between the two. Isn't it fascinating, too, that of our first 6 presidents, we had 4 from Virginia and 2 from Massachusetts?
I mean, clearly JQ also loved George Washington, but everybody loved George just like everybody loves Raymond. Andrew Jackson probably would have told you he didn't have a favorite president, but he was clearly a fan of Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
The feeling wasn't mutual, I should say. Jefferson thought Jackson was terrifying and dangerous for the country. Martin Van Buren grew up a fan of Thomas Jefferson, but many might argue that Andrew Jackson ultimately became his favorite president, mostly because...
You have to remember that entire, the modern Democratic Party, we refer to them now, many of the early presidents like Jefferson and Monroe and Madison, as Democratic Republicans, and we refer to them as that, though they themselves would have referred to themselves as Republicans. But we call them Democratic Republicans to differentiate them from the modern Republican Party, which was born in the 1850s. The modern Democratic Party really begins with Andrew Jackson. And a lot of the subsequent Democratic presidents, we call them Jacksonian Democrats.
Because Jackson listened to Van Buren. Seriously, Van Buren was one of Jackson's top advisors while he was president and served under him as Secretary of State, Minister to the United Kingdom, and, Vice President. Heck, Van Buren helped start a brand new political party, the Democratic Party, completely built around Jackson's popularity.
Right, so I mean, we're looking at the first 8 presidents, and with the exception of Washington, Adams, and Andrew Jackson, the other 5 were all secretaries of state. And in the case of Washington and Adams, there wasn't really an opportunity for them to be secretaries of state, since they're the very first president and vice president. So of the people who could have been Secretary of State, 6 out of 7 presidents in a row had been secretaries of state.
But I think people who say Jackson was Van Buren's favorite president are wrong. Van Buren used to not like Jackson, after all, and really just tried to mold Jackson into being like him. Nah, man. Van Buren's favorite president was Jefferson, after all. William Henry Harrison's favorite president was George Washington.
Makes sense.
At least we can assume that, since Washington was a family friend when Harrison was a kid. John Tyler's favorite president was Thomas Jefferson. How do we know this? Well, this glowing letter he wrote to Jefferson on June 10th, 1804 gives us pretty good insight. In it, Tyler kissed Jefferson's butt big time, saying stuff like, quote, "With a heart full of gratitude, I declare to you how much delighted I am with the general tenor of your administration, as the fruits of it are so productive of peace and liberty at home and reputation abroad."
That's interesting. I had no idea John Tyler wrote such a letter. Obviously, this is a good 40 years before Tyler becomes president himself, so a lot could have changed. But
Okay, dude.
calm yourself.
Maybe you two should get a room. James Polk was a huge fan of
Makes
Andrew
sense.
Jackson. He was one of Jackson's earliest political supporters,
And our two presidents that are buried in and around Nashville.
and he even advised Jackson on his presidential campaign in 1828. In the House of Representatives, Polk was arguably Jackson's most vocal supporter. As president, Polk seemingly went out of his way to govern like Jackson governed. While we don't know for sure, my best guess is that Zachary Taylor's favorite president was George Washington. I mean, his dad had worked for Washington, and many of
Both
Taylor's
Virginians?
political views echoed Washington's. Millard Fillmore
Alec
also
Baldwin.
loved George Washington, and we know this because he praised him on multiple occasions. We also know that he visited Washington's home of Mount Vernon and, heck, even signed a bill creating Washington Territory.
Interesting.
Franklin Pierce's favorite president was Andrew Jackson. In fact, Jackson was so influential on Pierce that he inspired him to first enter politics in 1828.
Interesting. At a time when there's such a north-south divide. Now, granted, Franklin Pierce is a northerner with very strong southern sympathies. It's interesting for a northerner to so strongly identify with a strong southern Democrat like Andrew Jackson.
It's pretty clear that James Buchanan's favorite president was George Washington, and that's rooted in his mother's love of Washington. His mom even named Buchanan's brother George Washington. Buchanan,
A lot of people did,
as
though.
president, Buchanan made multiple trips to Mount Vernon, once saying that Washington's time as president, quote, was characterized by such wisdom and virtue that, after the strictest examination, it is now admitted to be the most proper guide. It's weird to me to think that the guy who most historians say was the greatest American president even had a favorite president. But he did. As far as we can tell, Abraham Lincoln's favorite president was, you probably guessed it already, George Washington. In fact, Lincoln believed that Washington should be remembered as having no flaws whatsoever. Quote, "It makes human nature better to believe that one human being was perfect, that human perfection is possible," Lincoln once said of Washington. Andrew Johnson's favorite president was
Jackson.
likely Andrew
Yeah.
Jackson. According to the historian Annette Gordon Reed, Jackson was Johnson's, quote, hero, and he, quote, admired him greatly.
All these Tennesseans, they loved Andrew Jackson. I'm not surprised by that at all.
And now we get to all the Abraham Lincoln fanboys. Ulysses Grant.
Yeah, but you got to remember, Abraham Lincoln, at that point in history, only Republican president. And what follows is a slew of Republican presidents, most of whom were generals in the Civil War when Abraham Lincoln was commander-in-chief. It makes total sense to me that these people, many of whom knew Lincoln, felt that way. Now, Garfield, when he was a congressman during the Civil War, was not a big fan of Lincoln, but I think his view changed over time.
loved Abraham Lincoln. At his funeral, Grant said, quote, "To know him personally was to love and respect him for his great qualities of heart and head, and for his patience and patriotism." Grant, of course, had worked closely with Lincoln as his leading general.
Interesting picture, by the way, right there. You have Alan Pinkerton on the left, and then you have John McClernand on the right, who was a political general. He was a war Democrat and a really lousy general at that.
During the American Civil War. In fact, their partnership pretty much saved the Union. The next two presidents were also Civil War heroes who greatly admired President
Harrison
Lincoln.
And Garfield.
Rutherford Hayes, also loved George Washington, but it's safe to say Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War deeply moved Hayes, which is why I'm going with him as his favorite president. James Garfield often spoke about the greatness of Lincoln. He even had Lincoln's oldest son, Robert Todd
Secretary
Lincoln,
of War,
in his administration.
Yeah, he's going to say it.
Like Lincoln, Garfield was assassinated while serving. Crazy enough, Robert Todd Lincoln was with him when he got shot.
Yeah, and then Lincoln was the next building over when William McKinley was shot in Buffalo.
It's unclear who Chester Arthur's favorite president was, but it is clear that he didn't like James Polk. As a young dude, he even got involved with a brawl against students who supported Polk in 1844.
Hey, let's talk for a minute about the Netflix, I think it's a Netflix series that's coming out. That's going to be about the events surrounding the assassination of James Garfield. Matthew McFadden, who's an amazing actor, by the way, plays Charles Guiteau, the assassin. And Chester Arthur is going to be played by none other than Ron Swanson himself, Nick Offerman. I'm really excited about that.
Still, there is at least some evidence that he liked Abraham Lincoln, especially since he kept Robert Todd Lincoln in his administration after Garfield was assassinated. A loyal Democrat his entire life, Grover Cleveland's favorite president likely was Thomas Jefferson,
yeah.
Although there's little evidence he brought him up much. However, he very much governed like Jefferson and had strikingly similar beliefs about government as Jefferson. Benjamin Harrison is another Civil War veteran who loved Abraham Lincoln. As a young lawyer, he made more than 80 stump speeches for Lincoln during his presidential campaign in 1860.
I didn't know that.
Harrison
That's cool.
once wrote, quote, "One should be very careful of his words when he attempts to say anything worthy of the illustrious Lincoln. I am sure if I were to attempt to write, I should fall below the great theme." William McKinley is yet another Civil War veteran who loved Lincoln. On February 12th, 1896, he gave a speech in Chicago honoring Lincoln, saying, quote, "The martyr of liberty, the emancipator of a race, the savior of the only free government among men, may be buried from human sight, but his deeds will live in human gratitude forever." And the next two presidents loved Lincoln too. On June 13th, 1906, Theodore Roosevelt said, quote, "I do not have to tell you that my great hero is Abraham Lincoln, and I have wanted while president to be the representative of the, quote, plain people in the sense that he was. Not, of course, with the genius and power that he was, but according to my lights along the same line."
And I love that because these are my two favorite presidents right there. And to see that praise and that admiration there is cool. And again, to see that famous photograph where what we have are both of them in the same photograph, even though Lincoln's in the casket and he's dead. And you have a childhood Theodore Roosevelt in the window.
Yep, Teddy got all humble all of a sudden when referring to Honest Abe. And Teddy's protege, William Taft, equally praised Lincoln. On February 11th, 1911, he signed a bill into law approving of the building of the now iconic Lincoln Memorial. And then later as Chief Justice, on May 30th, 1922, he dedicated...
And hey, let's point out right here, it's hard to see, I know, but we've got William Howard Taft right there. We've got President Harding right there. And sitting right here, that's Robert Todd Lincoln, right at the end of his life.
it. Quote, "The American people have waited 57 years for a national memorial to Abraham Lincoln. Those years have faded the figures of his contemporaries, and he stands grandly alone. His life and character and the calmer and juster vista of half a century inspire a higher conception of what is suitable to commemorate him." Dang, it just seemed that everybody loved Raymond. Or everybody loved Lincoln. That is, until this guy showed up.
Wilson?
Woodrow Wilson wasn't so much a Lincoln fan.
Jackson.
His favorite president was Thomas Jefferson. On April 13th,
Well, good. They were both kind of scummy human beings, so that's all right.
In 1916, he said, quote, "The immortality of Thomas Jefferson does not lie in any one of his achievements or in the series of his achievements, but in his attitude towards mankind and the conception which he sought to realize in action of the service owed by America to the rest of the world. Thomas Jefferson was a great leader of men because he understood and interpreted the spirits of men." All right. Back to Lincoln. Warren Harding's favorite president was Lincoln.
So every single president who was born in Ohio has Lincoln as their favorite president. All right.
On February 20th, 1923, he said of Lincoln, quote, "It was the moral intensity of this one man which, more than anything else, made the men of his time appear to us as giants." While Calvin Coolidge often spoke highly of Lincoln as well, I'd argue his favorite president was actually George Washington.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
On Washington's 199th birthday in 1931, oh, in case you were wondering, Washington was dead by then, newspapers published this little bit of wisdom by Coolidge. Quote, "His public life was characterized by complete unselfishness. Indifferent to his own fortunes, his only concern was for his country."
And if you read this, understanding these are words coming from Calvin Coolidge, it makes a lot of sense because this is Calvin Coolidge praising the aspects of George Washington's character that it's pretty clear Calvin Coolidge was trying to emulate in his own life, both personally but also as president.
He needed no pretense and no art. He was simply and naturally great. From every avenue of approach, we find a complete man. In all his actions, he was precise, accurate, methodical.
I always found Calvin Coolidge to be such a unique man among presidents. There's just, it's hard for me to even really think of another American president that I can really compare him to, and that's why I think he's very unique in that sense.
Coolidge was famously a man of few words, but he said quite a bit with those few words that you just heard, didn't he? Herbert Hoover's favorite president, believe it or not, appeared to be Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah.
He was
Makes
a big
sense.
supporter of his, even when he ran on the third-party Bull Moose Progressive Party presidential ticket in 1912. On October 26, 1929, Hoover honored Roosevelt by saying he was a man with, quote, "stalwart character and vigorous ideals." Franklin Roosevelt's favorite president was Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, that is. His fifth cousin.
And uncle-in-law.
Yeah, perhaps he was biased too, but Teddy was a mentor.
Theodore Roosevelt walked Eleanor down the aisle at their wedding when Franklin married her because Eleanor was actually a Roosevelt by birth. She was Theodore Roosevelt's brother's daughter.
To FDR and was a huge inspiration to him. On January 8th, 1938, FDR gave a speech about political parties and loyalty saying, quote, "My father and grandfather were Democrats, and I was born and brought up as a Democrat, but in 1904, when I cast my first vote for a president, I voted for the Republican candidate, Theodore Roosevelt, because I thought he was a better Democrat than the Democratic candidate." I should say that FDR also loved Thomas Jefferson, and he was a big reason why the Jefferson Memorial got built. It's safe to say that Harry Truman's favorite president was Andrew Jackson. He once said of him, quote, "He wanted sincerely to look after the little fellow who had no pool."
Unless that little fellow was a Native American. Or African American.
That's what a president is supposed to do. On December 26, 1949, he dedicated a statue of Andrew Jackson on the lawn of the Jackson County Courthouse in Independence, Missouri, Truman's hometown. Yeah, the county of Truman's hometown was named after Andrew Jackson. We really don't know for sure who Dwight
Lincoln.
Eisenhower's favorite president was, but I can make a pretty good guess.
Washington.
Washington. It's clear Washington had a significant influence on him, and their lives, as well as philosophical and political views, were pretty similar. There's evidence that Ike enjoyed reading about Washington growing up, and his portrait was the only presidential one near his desk in the Oval Office. Oh, and he painted a portrait of him. Well, I should say that he also painted a portrait of Abraham Lincoln. John F. Kennedy.
Pretty good painter. I never realized his art was that good.
Kennedy is unique in that he likely had several favorite
FDR.
presidents. It's probably because he read so much American history as a young man. There's evidence he loved both John Quincy Adams and Franklin Roosevelt, despite there being tensions between the Roosevelt family and Kennedy family. However, I think his favorite was Thomas Jefferson. JFK famously said at a dinner honoring Nobel Prize winners on April 29th, 1962, quote, "I think this is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has ever been gathered together at the White House," with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. Lyndon Johnson's favorite president was Franklin Roosevelt. On
Makes a lot of
January
sense.
31st,
There's a lot of similarities in how Johnson governed and the policies that he advocated for, that you could really argue that Johnson was trying to be a second Roosevelt administration, a fifth term for Franklin Roosevelt.
1967, he accepted a portrait of FDR saying, quote, "For me and for millions of others, any likeness of this man is an inspiration." Richard Nixon's favorite prez was likely Woodrow Wilson. Wilson's foreign policy, in particular, had a big influence on Tricky Dick. Nixon proudly hung a big picture of Wilson in his office. Nixon even returned Wilson's desk to the Oval Office when he was president. Gerald Ford? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Look at Gerald Ford. They're affectionately staring at his favorite president.
Ike.
Well, a statue of his favorite president. Yep, Ford's favorite president was likely Dwight Eisenhower. Quote, "Eisenhower had a tremendous impact on my life and my career," Ford said right before that picture was taken. "By his actions, as well as his words, Ike epitomized everything good about a military leader and a politician. For me, Ike was a role model."
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Gerald Ford's a Navy vet from World War II, saw some combat in World War II, and I can see why he would idolize Eisenhower as a leader, and they were both tremendous athletes in college as well.
Jimmy Carter's favorite president is Harry Truman. Yeah, but how do we freaking know this? Well, he once said, and I quote, "My favorite president, and the one I admired most, was Harry Truman."
It's the first one in this entire thing that actually used the phrase, "my favorite president is," or was.
Okay then. We believe you, I guess. Ronald Reagan's favorite president was famously Calvin Coolidge. Reagan prominently placed Coolidge's portrait in the cabinet room when he was president.
Makes a lot of sense. Reagan's very much the government is too big, it's too strong, less government is good. Whereas Coolidge was very much about like hands off and laissez-faire, kind of like just don't intervene, don't do too much, be a caretaker kind of thing.
Coolidge's unwavering belief in the Constitution of the United States and the rule of law is a beacon of light for all of us to follow.
George H.W. Bush's favorite president was probably Abraham Lincoln. Oh, we got some pretty good evidence for that. Roll that beautiful bean footage.
Well, Abraham Lincoln truly inspired me. And it wasn't just the freeing of the slaves. He kept the Union together. Some people even forget that today. But what I think inspired me was the fact that in spite of being the President of the United States, he retained a certain down-to-earth quality. Never got to be a big shot. and cared about people.
See? As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Bill Clinton's favorite president is John F. Kennedy. And it
interesting too, because we're talking about two of the youngest presidents ever elected to the office.
It goes back to this moment. As president, Clinton gave a speech at the dedication of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum on October 29th, 1993.
He was our president for only 1,000 days, but as has been said so eloquently by members of his family, he changed the way we think about our country, our world, and our own obligations to the future.
That's fair.
He dared Americans to join him on an adventure he called the New Frontier.
Well, obviously, George Bush Jr.'s favorite president is his dad, George H.W. Bush. I understand the bias. Obviously, Bush Jr. loves his father very much and had a wonderful relationship with him. One of the most beautiful eulogies I've ever seen was the one Bush Jr. gave at his father's funeral.
In his old age, Dad enjoyed watching police show reruns. The volume on high.
But since his favorite president was his dad, I should also mention his favorite president who wasn't his dad, Ronald Reagan.
Makes sense.
But come on, his dad was his vice president, so that's biased too. As I referenced at the beginning of this video, Barack Obama's favorite president is Abraham Lincoln. Boring.
One of the very few, and I should have been keeping track of this, but there's very few we've had whose favorite president was from the opposite party. You had Franklin Roosevelt, his favorite being a Republican, and Barack Obama, same deal. And granted, like I said before, we're undergoing constant party shifts, so it's not even necessarily fair to compare a party from one period to a party in another.
Just kidding. Yeah, but no joke. Obama once called Lincoln his, quote, homeboy. And he even wrote a handwritten essay praising Lincoln, marking the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, too. I mean, neither one of them were born in Illinois, but both are elected president from Illinois. And so, I mean, there's another very natural connection that the two have.
Impressive. As I also referenced at the beginning of this video, Donald Trump's favorite president is Andrew Jackson.
Opposite party.
He's made no secret of the fact that he considers him a hero. Early in his presidency, Trump visited Jackson's home, the Hermitage, located near Nashville, Tennessee.
Highly recommend you visit. Very cool, and you can knock off visiting James Polk's grave as well, which is on the grounds of the Tennessee State Capitol.
And of course, he prominently placed Jackson's portrait in the Oval Office. And this last one is a bit of a surprise. But I think Joe Biden's favorite president is Franklin Roosevelt.
I'm not surprised by that.
According to multiple sources, Biden has modeled his presidency after FDR. And I think that's an accurate assessment, actually. Biden has definitely gone after corporations way more than Obama or Clinton, the last two Democrat presidents, ever did. That said, I'm basing this mostly on his actions, not his words. Hey, that's it. That was every president's favorite president. If you're keeping score, congratulations to Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. Not only do most historians say you're the two best presidents in American history, but most presidents say you're the two best presidents in American history, which probably means even more, don't you think? But hey, what do you think, huh? What was the...
All right, so let me know what you think in the comment section below. Like I said, I knew at the top that, and he acknowledged it himself, that a lot of this was going to be speculation and really up for interpretation. But it was really interesting still to hear some of the quotes and see some of the sources he was using for that. And if nothing else, even if we're going to get bogged down in the idea of was it really their favorite, it's still interesting to hear how presidents admired their predecessors and modeled their own presidencies after those who came before them. And I think a lot of the reason why so many people admire George Washington is that he didn't have those predecessors. So much of what the presidency is because of what George Washington made it and the precedents that he set as president. So great job as always, Mr. Beat. I think you did a fantastic job with that. Check out some of my other Mr. Beat reactions in the pinned comment down in the comments section. Thanks for watching.